Good morning, everyone.
Morning.
You know, reading through the prophets is not always the most pleasant of experiences. I find that especially as we're working through the text this morning, which is in Habakkuk, chapters 1 through 3, just a sampling of text. Back in 2008, there was kind of a surprise movie hit called Slumdog Millionaire. How many of y'all have seen that movie? Okay. Most of you have. Just a couple of you have. All right. Until you see the film, the title is kind of odd, Slumdog Millionaire. But it's about this Mumbai teenager who grows up in the slums of India, and then he eventually becomes this contestant on India's version of Who Wants to Be a Millionaire. And on one level, it's this story of a poor boy who makes good. Yet the success of the main character isn't quite enough to drown out the enduring images of millions who are left in poverty. And the movie, in many ways, portrays the dark underbelly of India and in some sense of humanity in general. And in the picture, there's this kind of unending and overwhelming despair as you watch the lives of these people, of violence and abuse, of greed and manipulation. It's just a story of cruelty and indifference in many ways as you watch this movie. And there is this scene in the story where this young boy is intentionally blinded by his handlers so that he will be a more profitable beggar. And it would be nice if we could comfort ourselves and just kind of go with that, that line, but it's only a movie. Until we recognize that this horror is actually reality. Yes, I mean, that particular boy that was in the movie, when they yell take, he still has his two eyes, but there's countless others. It's a real story. It's the tragedy of human suffering. In fact, there's a child, Amir, a 12-year-old homeless boy in India, whose story is so much like that. He came to the big city after trying to get away from his abusive father, and he's kind of bewildered and aimless, and he starts begging there when very quickly this couple comes up and they give him cakes and they promise that they'll take care of him. But the cakes are drugged, and when he becomes drowsy, they put him in a rickshaw and carry him to an Orthodox doctor who amputates one of his legs so that he'll become a more profitable beggar. It's a real life story about the horrors of how humans treat other humans. It's a story that's repeated a million times over about the way the weak and the innocent become victims of the evil and selfish-minded people around them. And when we hear such stories, I think we're appalled. And the brutality of humans against other humans just shocks us. But for those of us who believe in God, sometimes we begin to wonder, how long, O God, will you tolerate such evil in the world? Why do you allow the wicked to at times seemingly triumph over the innocent and the good? And for some people, such scenes of violence and cruelty become arguments against God. In fact, there's a story of a Jewish woman who suffered in the Holocaust. She was in the concentration camps, and she'd seen, of course, many a horror. And there was this one story she tells where these two young Jewish boys were being taken somewhere in the back of a truck, and they fell out. And the Nazi guard takes the two boys, very young boys, and just slams them against the truck until they start to bleed, throws them back in the truck, and they take off. And the woman says, it was at that moment that I stopped praying to God. That evil had won in her mind. Evil, especially in its most pure and unadulterated forms, brings into question either the power of God or the goodness of God. And it's that issue that the prophet Habakkuk is going to address in our text this morning. This prophet is not as well known as some of the others. He dates to about 605 BC. He's in many ways a contemporary of the more well-known prophet Jeremiah. And he prophesies in the period where the Babylonians are on the rise. And he's a mere 2 decades before the kingdom of Judah itself will be reduced to ashes in 586. You see, after a brief period of reform under King Josiah, in which they had gotten rid of the mediums and the spiritists, where they had taken out the household gods and the idols, the Jews then fell back again under King Jehoahaz into their old ways. And the people of Judah were guilty of the same offenses that we've read about in those other prophets, in Amos and Hosea. The guilt of offenses against the poor, the weak, and the vulnerable. And there was no justice in the land, but rather the strong were preying upon the weak, and it is causing Habakkuk a problem. Unlike the other prophets that we've read about and that we've talked about, Habakkuk doesn't address his words to the people of Judah or Israel, but his words are directed at God himself. He cries out in complaint to God. Let's look at the first section in chapter 1, verse 2. How long, O Lord, must I call for help, but you do not listen? Or cry out to you, violence, but you do not save? Why do you make me look at injustice? Why do you tolerate wrong? Destruction and violence are before me. There is strife and conflict abounds. Therefore the law is paralyzed, and justice never prevails. The wicked hem in the righteous so that justice is perverted. Habakkuk is calling God out for his apparent inaction. After all, God had promised way back when he made a covenant with the people of Israel in the time of Moses that he would not tolerate evil, that he would do something about those who violated his law. But Habakkuk is looking around him and he sees evil triumphing over good. He's living in a time where the people have forsaken their God. False prophets abound and are encouraging them. Violence fills the land. They're not living according to the law of God. Yet Habakkuk has prayed and he has prayed, and God doesn't seem to act. He has believed the message of God, that God is a God of justice. And how then have things deteriorated to the point that they are at now, he thinks. He wonders. There's an incongruity here. God is allowing things to continue that just simply should not happen. God seems deaf to the pleas of Habakkuk. He seems not to care. And so the cry of Habakkuk, as we think about this, I think, is a common sentiment that many of us perhaps have had at one time or another. All theists, I think, have had to deal with this. Christians in particular. The idea that if God exists and God is good, why does he allow evil to happen? Why is it that at times it seems like evil triumphs? And for us, I think the question can take many different forms. Sometimes it's simply that kind of philosophical query that we can have in kind of an objective sense. We look around us and see the injustice of the world, and we're forced to address the problem of evil. As Christians, sometimes we find ourselves even defending our God in the face of non-believers who are using evil as an excuse not to believe. And there's no shortage, of course, of injustice, and stories abound about those who are weak being preyed upon by those who are strong. One example is human trafficking. That's kind of the modern lingo for slavery. Here's a quote a few years old from former Secretary of State Clinton. Around the world, millions of people are living in bondage. They labor in fields and factories under brutal employers who threaten them with violence if they try to escape. They work in homes for families that keep them virtually imprisoned. They are forced to work as prostitutes or beg in the streets, fearful of the consequences if they fail to earn their daily quota. They are women and men and children of all ages, and they are often held far from home with no money, no connections, and no way to ask for help. And the injustice that's happening is not just in third world countries. The United States is a destination country for thousands of men, women, and children. And Nashville itself is not immune. In fact, just this last Friday, 41 people were arrested in a sting operation against human trafficking. Yet these issues somehow, I think, seem far removed from us at times. We hear the numbers and we're saddened, but we don't take action because after all, what are we going to do? We don't know what to do. We don't know these people. And thus it becomes more of a kind of a philosophical issue for us. Something to be debated and discussed and mourned over and considered and pondered. But what to do? After most of the major tragedies, I think about Columbine, I think about the school shootings, I think about all these, 9/11, that after these major publicized tragedies, you'll have this kind of plethora of sermons about the problem of evil, and then we've got to go on with our lives. And we think of it connected with those major instances of deep evil. But I think there's a deeper level at which we often connect with and encounter the cry of Habakkuk. And it's far more personal and closer to home. It's when injustice touches us. It's when that evil comes to visit. It's when you or someone you love becomes the victim of that perpetrator. And then it takes on a whole new meaning, and we cry out, "How long, O Lord, must I call for help, and you do not listen?" When you are the one who is abused, or your child is the one who is molested, the cry becomes personal. Last week we talked in the passage of Micah where God set forth His expectations. He wants us to do justly, to love mercy, and walk humbly with your God. But we too have expectations of our God, that He will act justly, that He will act righteously to save and protect. But when we see evil and we see injustice around us, it causes us to wonder. The drunk driver who perhaps kills himself but takes a child with him. A husband who is verbally or physically abusive to a spouse, stealing her dignity and her personhood and her sense of self. A child, your child, who is innocent, and that innocence is stolen by someone for their own gratification. These stories, they're not far from us. How long, O Lord, must we put up with these things? It is not just injustice that causes us to question God. Evil has many different forms. I have a friend many years ago who had a daughter, 8 years old, with a brain tumor. There was surgery in prayer. There was therapy in prayer. There were drugs in prayer. And she still died. She did not survive. How long, O Lord, must I call for help, but you do not listen? Some ask for a mother's life and she died. Some ask for their parents' marriage to be saved and there's still a divorce. Others ask for a spouse and their love, but they still leave for another lover. How long, O Lord? And so God replies. He's not silent to the question of Habakkuk. He replies in verse 5. Look at the nations and watch and be utterly amazed, for I'm going to do something in your days that you would not believe, even if you were told. I'm raising up the Babylonians, that ruthless and impetuous people who sweep across the whole earth to seize dwelling places not their own. See, God answers, He says, things aren't exactly what they seem to be. I have a plan, and the wicked will not go unpunished. God is going to do something that no one would ever have predicted. He's going to use the Babylonians as an instrument of His wrath to visit upon the people of Judah. But Habakkuk's not really thrilled by that answer. He's not comforted at all. He's like, wait a minute. How could you use a people who are unjust to perform justice? The Babylonians are more wicked and ruthless than the people of Judah. Why should they prosper? And so Habakkuk issues a second complaint. This is verse 12 and following. O Lord, are you not from everlasting? O Lord, you have appointed them to execute judgment. O rock, you have ordained them to punish. Your eyes are too pure to look on evil. You cannot tolerate wrong. Why then do you tolerate the treacherous? Why are you silent while the wicked swallow up those more righteous than themselves? I will stand at my watch and station myself on the ramparts. I will look to see what he will say to me and what answer I'm to give to this complaint. So God's solution has created this deep angst within Habakkuk. How can God bring about justice through the unjust? Indeed, the Babylonians do destroy Judah, as God predicted. But at the time, and here's where you have to get this, at the time it's going to appear to the Jews as if God has failed them. From their perspective, it looks like God abandoned them. But the reality is, and this is the message Habakkuk wants us to know, is that God is still in control, even in that moment of their deepest, darkest despair. And so God begins to answer Habakkuk's second complaint with these words. Look at chapter 2, verse 2. Then the Lord replied, write down the revelation and make it plain on tablets so that a herald may run with it. For the revelation awaits an appointed time. It speaks of the end and will not be proven false. Though it linger, wait for it. It will certainly come and will not delay. See, he is puffed up. His desires are not upright, but the righteous will live by his faith. Now, it's very confusing prophetic language there, but what God is talking about is he's going to describe what's going to happen to the Babylonians. He's going to give a revelation about their own future. And the revelation is about their destruction and their humiliation, but it's not going to happen immediately. In fact, as I said, it will appear at the time that evil is triumphing. But God is faithful, and he calls his people to be faithful and trust and wait for the revelation to become a reality. He contrasts the wicked who is puffed up to the righteous who will survive by faith. A better translation here might even be faithfulness, steadfastness. What God is calling his followers to do is to trust him, to continue to follow, even when in the face of things it seems like the evidence is all against God. See, the Babylonian conquest of Judah will appear to indict God. It will appear that God is either impotent or uncaring. When they see the horses and chariots of the enemy drawing near to their gates, they will feel as if God abandoned them. But the reality is that God is still active in that very moment, doing something, working out his plan. He has not forgotten his people. But the revelation God gives in chapter 2 becomes clear that they will not prosper for long, and that in the end he's going to punish the Babylonians. Look at verse 16 and following. You will be filled with shame instead of glory. Now it is your turn. Drink and be exposed. This is to the Babylonians. The cup from the Lord's right hand is coming around to you, and disgrace will cover your glory. The violence you have done to Lebanon will overwhelm you, and your destruction of animals will terrify you. For you have shed men's blood. You have destroyed lands and cities and everyone in them. Habakkuk is saying, in due time the Babylonians will get theirs. God will use them, and then he will punish them. God's justice will prevail. Now, it's a very short book, very potent book. And I think there's two things I want us to learn from what's going on here in this text. First, it is the nature of our relationship with God. You see, Habakkuk isn't afraid to speak plainly with God, to complain to God. Too often as Christians, we hold back. We couch our prayers to God in pious words that we learned in church. We use all those tried and true phrases. We make it sound religious. Yet prayers are meant to be conversations. They're meant to reveal our hearts to God. They're meant to be who we really are, because he knows who we are. Why are we trying to hide it? And to be honest, our hearts are not always full of love and devotion. right? Sometimes, perhaps oftentimes, we're filled with pain, with anger, with disappointment, with despair. Why is it that we only show the good face to God? God wants us to express ourselves to Him. In any relationship we go through these phases. It's where when we first meet someone we like, we put on that front, the good one. It's kind of like you can always tell when a teenage boy is kind of infatuated with a girl because he now starts combing his hair and puts on unwrinkled clothes and maybe even brushes his teeth every now and then. And so he's putting up the front. But after a while, every relationship, you have to get to a point where you reveal yourself. Because a relationship will only survive when you are truly open and honest with that other person. They want to know not just the facade that you present to everyone else in the world, but they want to know your hopes and your fears and your dreams and your disappointments. And too often with God, we get stuck in that first phase, trying to present ourselves to God, as if He doesn't know. But He wants to know. And you look through the Jewish scriptures and you see lament, and you see complaint, and you see anger, and you see disappointment. Let's not just be parodying the phrases we learn in church, but God wants it all. And it's okay to express ourselves. Even our frustrations, to complain, to argue, to cry out. The woman I mentioned earlier, the Jewish woman who said, that was the moment I stopped praying to God. That was the very moment she should have started praying to God. Expressing her anger and her frustration. Yell and scream. God can take it. The second thing is that faith is trusting even in the face of doubt. Habakkuk teaches us this very important lesson about faith. That too often I think, we think of faith as this kind of unquestioning belief in God. But in this book what we see is Habakkuk struggling with significant questions. Events have caused doubts to come to his mind about the reliability of God. And in the very midst of this, he's struggling with God. But at that same time, he's learning the true meaning of faith. Too often, I think, as modern Christians, we see God at work only in the times where there's prosperity and blessing. When things are going well, there's God at work. Yet Habakkuk wants us to know that God is there always, even in our pain. That when God seems deaf, He has heard our cries. And an answer is coming. Maybe not in the form that you thought it would, maybe not in the timing you thought it would, but an answer is coming. And He asks us to wait and to trust and to live steadfastly, just putting one foot in front of another and walking with Him as we go, not seeing where it all might turn out, but believing in God even when the evidence around us says something different. Faith is knowing all the reasons not to believe, but still choosing to believe. Even though you don't understand, even though it doesn't make sense, even though it doesn't seem like it will be the way you want it to be, trusting God that He will not abandon you, that He hasn't abandoned you. God does not promise that bad things will not happen to good people. It happens all the time. What He does promise is that in the end, justice will be done. That in the end you can rely on God, that He is faithful, and that in the end, God will make it right. And so this book doesn't answer all those philosophical questions we have about the problem of evil. But the answer it does give to us, the message that it is trying to communicate, is a reminder, a very important reminder, that things are not always what they seem. Although you might think God is absent, or asleep, or oblivious, or deaf to your pain, and your anguish, your frustration, your anger, God has not forgotten His people. He's not forgotten you. And the events that present themselves to our senses at the moment are not the end of the story. God has a plan. And in the end, his people will triumph. But the praise teams come back up. Habakkuk leaves us finally with this text in chapter 3. And he resolves in his own heart and mind to trust in God. And I love this text. In the final chapter of the book, it's the vision of God's final conquest, a vision that at times will require a great deal of faith on the part of those who hear it. But it is a knowledge about the character of God. So let's read this part in chapter 3, verse 16 and following it. The words of his closing prayer. Yet I will wait patiently for the day of calamity to come on the nation invading us. Though the fig tree does not bud, and there are no grapes on the vines, though the olive crop fails, and the fields produce no food, though there are no sheep in the pen, and no cattle in the stalls, yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will be joyful in the God, my Savior. The sovereign God is my strength, and he makes my feet like the feet of a deer. He enables me to go on the heights. When all is said and done, to follow God requires faith. A faith that trusts in who he is, not what the events around us tell us. Let us praise that God this morning.